Okay, welcome everybody. On behalf of Holocaust Museum LA, my name is Michael Morgenstern, and I am an educator at the museum. I'm pleased to welcome everybody to our program for the inaugural Holocaust Survivor Day, a day recently created by Michael Berenbaum, a historian and director of the Siggy Ziering Institute at American Jewish University, and Jonathan Ornstein, director of JCC Krakow. In their words, Holocaust survivors deserve a day of joy, a day of celebration, not a day to share with condemnation of the Nazis, but a day to celebrate their lives they built in response to the Holocaust. Survivors represent the best in all of us, the best of the human spirit. They are our treasure and our light, and we must shine that light into every dark corner of our world. We call on the world to join us and celebrate the inaugural Holocaust Survivor Day on June 26th. June 26th is the birthday of Marian Tursky, a noted historian, journalist, and Holocaust survivor. This year, however, we're celebrating on June 24th because the 26th falls on Shabbat. Our museum was founded in the early 1960s by a group of survivors who were dedicated to creating a space in their city of Los Angeles for commemoration, education and inspiration. Holocaust survivors, their families, and their stories have always played a prominent role in our museum. Today, we are honored to have 3 Holocaust survivors from our community with us to share and discuss parts of their stories. Harry Davids and Leah Frank, both from the Netherlands, and Edith Frankie from Transylvania, which is Romania and Hungary, as you'll learn a little bit.
Miraculous country.
And the 3 of them are very active with our museum's education programs. We're so honored to have the 3 of you with us this early afternoon to share a little bit with us and to educate our community. First and foremost, we thank the 3 of you and our entire survivor community for everything that you do for educating our community and our future generations on such a regular basis. We'll start by asking the 3 of you, and we'll start with Harry. If you can please just share really briefly your experiences during the Holocaust with our audience.
All right. Well, Michael, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this panel and for all the work that you and the museum are doing to further Holocaust education. In my case, which is a little unusual, because whatever I'm going to share with you now is based in almost entirely on research. I have no personal recollection of anything because I was born in the middle of the Holocaust in the Netherlands, about a year after the Netherlands was invaded by Germany. That was in May 1940. I was actually born in the fall of 2 years afterwards. I was born in the fall of 1942. And so obviously I would have no recollection of the things that happened there. And only because of research that has taken 70 years and longer, do I even know most, I believe now, of what had happened. My birth mother was pregnant with me in the 3rd trimester of her pregnancy when the major roundups of Jews began in Amsterdam in the Netherlands in mid-July 1942. And she and my father were not able to find a hiding place for that reason. And they were stuck until after I was born. When I was about 2 months old, they found a family through the Dutch resistance. They were able to find a family living not far away who took me into their home Uh, and there was already one young Jewish woman living there at the time. Somehow, probably because of an informant, the Germans showed up a few months later, took the parents away, took the young Jewish girl away, and also took the daughter of this family away. It's a long story. We don't have time for it. But what happened was the Dutch resistance rescued me from that house. The Germans were supposed to come back for me after interrogating the others. And the Dutch resistance found out about this before they returned and snatched me out of the house and took me away and eventually sent me to a different part of the Netherlands to be hidden, where again I was informed on and again rescued just in time by the resistance and taken to the north of the Netherlands to the province of Friesland, where a family of 6 took me. It was supposed to have been temporary, but they changed their minds and they made it permanent. And I stayed with them until after the war was over, until after we were liberated. After the war, an uncle of mine, who was one of 4 of my father's siblings, who had made a smart move and had left Europe before the war began, and therefore these 4 were all still alive after the war. They found out about me. They didn't even know I existed until after the war was over. And one of them, an uncle in South Africa, living in South Africa at the time, came to Europe to claim me. My rescuing family refused to give me up. This uncle had to have a lawsuit for custody against my own rescuing family, which he won very narrowly, and then took me to Africa with him. Uh, and that was where I was raised until many years later, decades later, when I moved to the United States. And all the details of this I had to learn from research. I have no personal memories of, but I do speak at the museums and other places in order to honor the people who rescued me, the upstanders versus most of the people who are the bystanders.
Thank you so much, Harry. Leah, if you could please introduce yourself and just give a very brief account of your experiences during the Holocaust, please. Thank you.
My name is Leah Frank, and I was born in the Netherlands, Holland, the Netherlands in 1936. I was born to a very traditional family, mother, father. On my 3rd birthday, I received a big gift. I received a little sister. So we were 2 girls, and parents and grandparents and uncles and aunts. And in 1940, the Germans invaded Holland. And I was born in a smaller city. I was not living in Amsterdam. I was living in Utrecht. And it was relatively quiet in Utrecht. The big raid started, of course, in Amsterdam, where most of the Jews lived. But when they were done with Amsterdam in 1942, it was Judenfrei. They came to the outlying areas, and on April 18th, 1943, which was the day after my 7th birthday, my parents had decided to let us go into hiding. We were picked up from our own home by people that we knew that were in the resistance. They were Gentile people, good friends of my parents. And we were told we would be going away for a few days and we would see each other in a few days again. And that was the last time I ever saw my parents. Subsequently, my sister and myself were the resistance organization found us a home. We were separated for 2.5 years. They found her a home on a farm because she had more of a Semitic look. And I was placed with a doctor's family smack in the center of the city of Amersfoort. And I stayed there for well over 2 years. People were very good, very kind, very different from my own parents. But I was relatively safe until one time a housekeeper got a suspicion and started to interrogate me, but I didn't give anything away. And I stayed there until after liberation. Liberation came, and I was waiting for my parents to come back, which obviously never happened. I found out much later that they had gone into hiding, as had my two grandmothers and my uncles and aunts. Everyone had gone into hiding and they were betrayed. And my mother was murdered or killed in Auschwitz. My father succumbed somewhere in Middle Europe. And the rest of the family either in Auschwitz or wherever. Probably my grandmothers were aghast upon arrival because they were a little bit older. My mother was all of 31 years old. And so after the war, I kept waiting for them to come back, for which we didn't know what had happened. And then one day, there's somebody has some background on here. I don't know who.
Leah, either you don't speak on your microphone because I can't hear you very well.
Do you have background
Okay, now,
noise? Okay, I'm sorry.
now I hear you.
Okay, a few months after liberation, someone showed up who was one of my only surviving uncle, a brother to my father, whom I knew him, but of course I was only 7 when I went into hiding, and I was 9.5, and we were not, we did not live in the same city. So he had located myself and then also my sister. So he came and asked if he could take me to see my sister, which of course was allowed. How we got there, I don't remember, because there was no food, there was no transportation, there was nothing, probably on a bicycle without tires. And when I saw my sister after almost 2.5 years, she had grown from 4 to 6.5. I did not recognize her, but we got reacquainted very quickly. And at the end of the day, of course, I did not want to leave her again. So I left for a few days back to my own hiding people. And then her hiding people, she lived on she was hidden on a farm. They had a big family already and they were relatively poor, but they accepted that I should come live with them. So the two sisters could be together. So then I was on parents number 3. And towards the end of the year, we found out that what had happened to our parents, because we kept asking, when are they coming? When are they coming? And they didn't show up. And there were no computers, of course, and no television and hardly any radio. So nobody really knew what had happened. So then my uncle, the only surviving uncle, and his wife, who had been in hiding for almost 3 years, they survived and they decided to become our guardians. So I was on parents number 4, again, totally different. And eventually we stayed with them with an interruption of being able to go to Denmark for a few months to recuperate, which made it parents number 5, because ultimately we stayed in Denmark for 9 months and we were spoiled, and that was the best time other than our parents. And eventually, of course, we had to return to Holland, and that's when our real life started. We had to go to school, and it was I wouldn't say a dysfunctional, but a very much PTSD family. Both my uncle, my aunt had suffered a lot during their hiding time. My aunt turned out to have been unbalanced, and I was very angry. So I had a very difficult time after the war. Eventually, the whole family immigrated to the United States, and from there on, life changed. So I am speaking at the museum because my ultimate rescuers was a student organization. They are the ones that found the places where children could be hidden. And so when I speak to students in a museum or wherever I speak to schools, I always make sure that they know that students have a lot of power, and I hope they will use it for the right cause, for the right purpose. And like Harry said, not be a bystander, be an upstander, but let your power, let your words and actions speak. But
Thank
that's
you so
a
much.
very short version.
Thank you so much, Leah. Edith, if you could please just really briefly share your just your experiences during the Holocaust with us.
Okay, I was I was born in a very small town, and that I was Romania. And in 1940, my parents were, I mean, my father was in agriculture. Never knew about buying any food out from the store. We had everything. My parents had during all the time had about 17 employees on the farm, because we had a flour mill, uh, we had livestock, we had winery, and we had a beautiful childhood. But in 1940, when Hungary occupied this part of the town of Romania, then when we went to school, the teacher said that you have to speak Hungarian. Well, we didn't have any problem because my parents at home spoke Hungarian, so our main language was Hungarian. But in 1942 or 43, I don't remember exactly, when the German occupied this part of the country, then when we went to school, our dear friends, they called us, because we had to wear the yellow star, they called us dirty Jews. So naturally, dirty meant dirty. And we asked them that, why do you call us dirty? You were in our house yesterday. You were eating there. So you saw how we were living. Why are we dirtier today than we were yesterday? That wasn't enough. We were beaten and thrown stones, mud at us, and we went home crying and all dirty that we don't want to go to school anymore. So my parents, being very sympathetic, they said, you're gonna clean up, physical punishment is gonna heal, but knowledge nobody can take away from you. So you go back to school again. So I'm speaking in plural because my sister and I, my other two siblings, they were way too young to go to school. And so one day my father played beautifully the violin, and every Saturday night he played, and all the dignitary of the town, they were there, and the mostly the Hungarian gendarmes, and they were eating and drinking and dancing and all that till when my father said about 12 o'clock that the host was kind of tired, so uh, the audience or whatever we call them, they should go home because you must be tired too. And nobody said one word to my parents. At 2 o'clock in the morning, those beautiful gendarmes who they were eating and drinking and dancing with the whole family at our house 2 hours before, they knocked at the door and they said, "Hey, you Jew, open up the door. You have 1 hour. Gather as much food as you can, but mostly everybody bring 2 change of clothing and be in the courtyard." So naturally, my parents obeyed and asked a youngster, we wanted to, what should I wear? Should I wear this? Should I wear that? So my mother, naturally being very strict, she says, no, you wear the warmest clothes what you have, because you can always peel it off. But you do sturdier shoes, what you have. So naturally, those days you have to listen to your parents. And within an hour, we were herded in a horse and wagon. And by that time, the other 2 families were in one other wagon behind, behind us. And we were going, and they were traveling for a while. And my father said, gee, this route looks very familiar. It was only about 25 kilometers, where every time when my parents wanted us to, introducing us to a kosher restaurant or see a movie or a play, there where he took us. It was about 25 kilometers altogether. But this time, it seemed to be an eternity. We didn't go all the way into to the city, and we stopped on the outskirts of the city. And we were asking the gendarmes and said, hey, you John or Peter, whatever their name was, could you tell us where are we here? What is this? So he says, you're gonna find out when you're going to just get out and get in. So my father was the first one who got out. And every time I talk about it, I can still picture those big, heavy green doors from top to bottom. You couldn't see inside at all. And my father opened the door, and we were astonished. It was a brickyard, and they were about 6,000 people there. All the neighborhood Jews, they were all gathered there because that was the ghetto. And as youngsters, they were taking us, they were teaching us sort of a storytelling way about the geography and starting to teach us languages. And this went on like this till we were, you make easy friends those days. And we met some other friends, and we talked about that after this makeshift class, we're gonna meet each other, but they never showed up. So we couldn't imagine why didn't they show up. And we asked our so-called teacher, said, why didn't they show up? So they said because they were taken into Germany to work. And naturally, we were very envious that taken into to Germany, seeing the world, and we are here stuck in this hellhole. But you didn't stop and think that, okay, the youngster, they went to work, even the parents, but what happened to the baby sister and their handicapped grandfather? What happened to them? You don't think about those things. And this went on for about 3 weeks, when every time there were less and less people. And if the way I remembered, it was July 31st when our transport was taken. We were the last transport. But afterwards, after the war, I researched the Red Cross, and it was August 6th. So whichever, doesn't matter. I always talk about it as July 31st. And we were backed into a train. The sanitary facility, naturally, nothing, 2 garbage pail on each side and 1 in the middle for water. And we were, that smell, people were crying, children were trying to misbehave, and the more religious people, they were praying. Naturally, no air whatsoever. The only 2 cubicles were on each side, very high, and the cattle wagon, and even that was crisscrossed with the barbed wire. Finally, we were traveling for about 2 days, or maybe more. I don't remember quite exactly. I think it was about 2.5 days, and finally the wagon stopped and the door opened, and we were so elated that finally we can get a breath of fresh air. But as soon you get closer to the door, you heard yelling, out, out. And as soon you hit the pavement, uh, men and boys to one side and women and children to the other side. That was the last time when I saw my father and my young brother, who insisted he wanted to go with my father, and never even had a chance to say goodbye. And so went on. When we marched forward, we had to register, and we were told to register older than we are, and try not to register at the same table, that the 2 last names shouldn't be the same. And I was holding my little cousin hand and marched up front, and I was the first one in front of that infamous gate, work makes life free. And as soon as they saw me, the SS touched me, said, oh, you have enough fat, go behind the gate to work. And took my little cousin and gave her to my sister, who was tall, very fair, very area looking. And she had another cousin holding. And when the SS looked aside, and my mother saw that I'm not with them, she took the 2 little cousins from my sister and said, run after Edith and try to be together again. I think a mother intuition, and that was saved her life. And naturally, that was the last time when we saw our parent, my mother, and never even had a chance to say goodbye. So this was in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, Edith, for sharing this part of your story with us. Now we have the next question for the three of you, and we'll start with Harry. When did you first start to share this story with people? Oh, Harry, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Can you hear now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
So I started sharing my story in 2008, which was shortly after I retired. Before that, there was just no time to be able to do this kind of work, but that was when I started.
Thank you. Leah, when did you start sharing this story with audiences?
I believe it was 1993 or maybe 94, after I had had a couple of major issues myself, and I started going for some help, and then I started sharing. Then I realized I did have a story to tell, which I never realized. I was told I never had a story to tell because I was a hidden child, and or had been a hidden child, and so I never. I mean, my family, of course, knows. My daughter knows, but I never shared it with an audience. But after I got some more insight into my own life, I started sharing about 93, 94. That's when I also became involved with the child survivors of the Holocaust.
Thank you so much, Leah. And there will be actually a follow-up question in a little bit relating to some of what you just said. Edith, when did you start to share your story publicly?
Oh, he should know what year was it when we were in the Federation, still in the Federation.
I believe this was in the mid-90s when I know that you became involved with our museum.
Yeah,
But before that, had you
yeah.
shared the story before?
So, and it must have been somewhat earlier when Dana Schwartz was looking for public speakers. And my husband signed up, but he didn't sign up his name, he signed my name. And Dana called me. I said, I never spoke. What I'm gonna tell? I said, I have nothing to say comparing to the other people, but I was listening, but telling their stories. So Dana just said, well, just tell me something about yourself. And I start talking and talking and talking and never stopped. And Dana called me that I am her prime student. And then when I started sharing my story at the museum, I think we were still at the Federation before before the earthquake, 1940, 44
Thank you.
earthquake.
94.
1994 big earthquake in Los Angeles, and the
Yeah,
museum had actually been at the Jewish Federation building for the years preceding that. So, Edith, this must have been like the early 1990s.
yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. And by the way, Edith mentioned Dana Schwartz, who is a survivor as well. And Dana has been active with our museum since about the late 70s. Dana was particularly involved in interviewing Holocaust survivors in our community. She also worked for the Shoah Foundation doing this later in the mid-90s, but even before that in the 80s, Dana worked with Holocaust survivors in our community with our museum to film some of these testimonies and record them. Leah, we have a follow-up question to what you had mentioned. So you talked about how at first you didn't realize that you had a story. Can you please talk a little bit about that and about how you discovered that even though you were young and hidden, you had a story to share?
Well, the reason I never had I thought I never had an actual story to share is because our own older survivors never really acknowledged that children, especially hidden children, of course, the few that survived the concentration camps, they did have a story to tell at that time. But we were never really recognized. The hidden children were never recognized as having been child survivors. So I mean, my family knew my story, but for instance, nobody outside of the immediate family knew my story because I didn't think I had a story to tell until I went into a support group in 1993. 1992 was a 1992-93 was were particularly difficult years with some major medical issues and some other issues. And so I went into a support group where there were other child survivors. And of course, um, I was sitting there and not sharing any story because the other survivors had more interesting or more intense stories to share until one of them said, "We haven't heard from you. What is your story?" And I said, "I don't have a story." And she said, she later became a therapist, so she knew a little bit about what she was talking. And of course, the therapist that led the group did not really interfere, or even interrupt. But I guess I was coaxed into telling my story, what I thought was not a story. And then at the end of my talk, it was decided, what do you mean you don't have a story? You lost your whole family, you lost your parents, you lost your grandparents, you came out of the Holocaust to just a sister and one uncle, etc., etc., etc. So that's when I realized I did have a story to tell. And slowly but surely, I started sharing my story. But even sometimes now, I think, what am I sharing compared to? But then I talk to myself and I realize everyone has a story. Every survivor has a story to tell.
Yes,
Much
yes,
and as mentioned, Holocaust survivors and their stories always played a very prominent role in our museum for that reason. Um, a question that, a big question for any of you, well, three of you. How should we or how do you define Holocaust survivor?
by going through hell and back, I presume. By going through the concentration camp, myself, other people by being hidden, like Leah and like Harry. So they lost their parents also, and they were fairly young. But I think that's what it means we are survivors. And I always say the reason why I survived, and even with my sister, I mean, I'm thanking my sister that I survived, but that we survived, it's, I think, instead of us, why not the other person? So I think it was meant to be to tell our story. to educate the public about it, and usually the students.
Thank you, Edith. Harry, what would you define Holocaust survivor?
I would say, and this sounds a little clinical, but I would say that a survivor is anyone who was at risk for their lives in a country occupied by Germany during World War II and who came out alive at the end. Because if you think of any person in that category, there's not a single person who fits that definition who does not have a story to tell, as Leah herself mentioned. If you are at risk for death, which you were if you were living as a Jewish person, for example, or as perhaps a member of the Roma or Sinti group, the group that we call the Gypsies, groups like that, if you're at risk for your life living in the German occupied country during the war, and you were still alive after the war, you're a survivor. You survived that.
Yeah.
That's just my personal definition.
So much for sharing this. We have one more question before we open it up to audience who to ask questions. This is specifically for Harry and Leah, since you were so much younger by the time the Holocaust ended. Did either of you discuss this with friends at school when you were still going to school afterwards?
Well, I can answer that very quickly. The answer is no. Also, we should be aware that in those days, nobody spoke about it, not even the parents, nobody. It was not something that you discussed until much, much later when it became more acceptable. For example, after the story about Anne Frank and her diary came out, and then later after the Eichmann trial in the early 1960s. But before then, people didn't discuss it. It wasn't a topic for suitable, polite discussion, if that's the right word I could use. I'm not sure if Leah would agree with that, but that's the way I remember it.
Well, is it my turn, Harry?
Yes.
Michael?
Yes.
I can tell you from personal experience that when Ellie and my sister and I, who were the only survivors of our immediate family, when we finally got settled in Amsterdam with my uncle and aunt, my uncle decided that he wanted us to go to Jewish day school and then following Jewish gymnasium or high school or whatever you want to call it. So that's what we did. I was with the same group of students. Some of them, there was attrition, of course, for 8 years. And I have no clue what happened to anybody in my class. They were all survivors. They were Jewish. It was a Jewish day school and a Jewish high school. So obviously they were all survivors. All we knew is that this one had a mother, or this one didn't have any parents and was living with an aunt, or this one had maybe a father or a sister. No one ever spoke about their experiences. We wanted to be normal, quote, whatever normal is or was in those days. We did not want to be different. And the last thing we wanted is to have anybody pity us, because we didn't want to be different than everybody else. So until this day, and we are now in our 80s, and a close friend of mine just passed away not very long ago in Holland. I know she must have had horrific experiences during the war. Never spoke about it. Not to us co-students, fellow students. We just didn't. We wanted to be normal, fitting in with the rest of the population.
Yeah.
But by the way, Michael, it's a really good question.
very much. Yes, Harry?
So I have this question for Leah. Did your your family members, the adult family members ever discuss it among themselves or ask you about it?
Well, like I said, we both, Ellie and I, had both been hidden children, with she on a farm and I in a doctor's family. And we had good homes, kind people. So it was always belittled, even by my aunt, that you were hidden, but you had a good place. And uh, what do you know, and how did you suffer, etc., etc. And the older generation, they didn't recognize us as having, not until, like I said, not until one of my child survivors, whom I really didn't know, put it in perspective and said, what do you mean you don't have a story? You lost your parents, you lost your grandparents, you lost your uncles, your aunts, your home, whatever. Did we realize that we were survivors? So they did not discuss it among themselves. Only sometimes my aunt, how, they'd been in a stable and, they had a difficult time, but no one was there to feel sorry for anybody. So,
Much. To those of you who are watching on Zoom, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box to type in any questions for any of the three panelists. And those watching on Facebook, you can type your questions in the comment box, and we'll get through as many questions as possible. Edith, did you talk about your experiences with your husband before you started speaking to groups at the museum?
Not really, because he was a survivor also. The only difference, he was in a forced labor and I was in slave labor. So mostly he was talking about his experience. He lost his father in Ukraine in 1940s, and we had the postcard what he was writing for his mother, and his mother was alive in Budapest. But mostly he was talking about it. I never talked about it.
Thank you. Did any of you ever seek therapy to help cope with the trauma? And if anyone has any kind of insight about the process of therapy and Holocaust survivors, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you. Yes, Harry.
I didn't actually seek therapy, but I did once ask someone who was a psychotherapist if there was a way for me to recollect the things that had happened, because I had no memory, while this was all happening. And she gave me a strange answer, which actually makes more sense when you think about it now. Uh, she said that I've got clients who are asking me to do exactly the opposite. They remember all these experiences. They were much older than you, and they had these terrible memories. And they come to me asking, is there some way that you can make these memories go away? And now here you come along asking me to make you try and remember the things that you've forgotten. I would advise you to let it rest. Nature apparently saw to it that you blocked everything from your mind, and maybe you should be grateful for that.
that's what your therapist said?
It wasn't my therapist, it was a therapist that I
A
happened to meet.
therapist, a
Yeah,
therapist.
and I just happened to ask her that question because she was a hypnotherapist as well. And I asked her about that. She said, I've got all these patients of mine whom I'm trying to treat, and they're asking me to make these memories that I do have go away. And you're asking me to bring back the memories that you don't have. Uh, these other patients that I have would be happy to be in your position. That was her response.
You.
I confess that in 1993, had to go in for therapy because I was, like I said, I had major medical issues. Then my uncle and aunt that became our guardians, they had one daughter when the war started. When the war ended, they had another daughter just 2 weeks after liberation. And then they had a son in 1949 who almost became like my baby because he was 13 years younger than I. I was very close to him, and he passed away in 1993. And that on top of my own issues, which was my issue, of course, I was pretty close to a nervous breakdown and had to go for help. And so, yes, I I have I had a therapist, and I still have a therapist. It was mainly to put in perspective what I had gone through certain things and how to deal with it. So, and people, there wasn't anything available in 1945. There were no therapists. One of our very favorite therapists, Dr. Kinsler, always told me, as not as a client, but just someone I knew, that she said we missed the boat completely in 1945.
Thank
So,
you for sharing. And Leah, thank you so much for that point. That's a really important thing to keep in mind, that as soon as the Holocaust ended, this wasn't really an option that was available for anyone. Edith, do you have any insight on this question? Anything you...
No, I never had any therapist. I don't know. I became sort of physically strong because I saw other survivors. They were so well, not pathetic looking, but they were constantly mentioning, well, I survived the Holocaust, this and that. And I decided I never gonna do that. I rather gonna teach them not to act that way, because sympathy, you don't want sympathy from other people. You share your knowledge with people, with young students who can learn from it, that this thing never should happen again. So no, I never I never had any therapist.
Thank you for sharing. And Edith, the next question was actually for you. Did you ever either go back to your family's home, your farm, and did you ever seek compensation for your family's property?
Um, no, I never went back. I tried to Romania, was asking, they said that gives compensation for if you had any property. So I called them up and asked them that, okay, how do you go about? He says, if you pay back the taxes since 1940 to now, then we'll be more than happy to give you the farm back. I said, you know what? Keep it. I didn't want to pay them good money. Who knows what's going to happen?
Thank you.
Michael, to come back to the therapy question for a minute,
Yes.
there was always a stigma attached right after the war.
No, it wasn't.
To go into therapy, people would say, well, where I come from, let me put it that way. Where I come from, people would say, first of all, it wasn't available, but later on when it became available and you would suggest someone go for some help, they would say, I'm not crazy, I'm not crazy. Because a psychiatrist, it
Of
was,
course.
you know, and that's the stigma I'm talking about. You know,
Mhm.
people always thought they could figure it out on themselves. And we cannot. Some of us can, maybe others cannot.
Thank you for adding that as well. That's important for all of us to keep in
Yeah.
mind. I thank you so much for mentioning that. We have another general question. Do your children who were born after the war ever express, or have they ever expressed that they somehow feel the effects on them from what you as their parents went through?
Who's the question for?
It's a general question.
Oh, general question.
For any-
My son was, I think, was third grade when Eichmann was captured, and they were showing backflashes with the Hungarian transport because Eichmann's was his famous beef was that he was gonna get rid of the Hungarians, and they were showing people disembarked at Auschwitz and other places. And I told my son he had to make a book report of this. And I told my son that if you look close, you might see me there. So he says, "What you talking about, mother?" I said, "Well, you could see, just look close." And he never asked me anymore. And I never mentioned that to him. I think I didn't want he should be brought up with hatred. Till he was married already and went back. They went for the honeymoon to Washington, and they went to the Holocaust Museum. And my daughter-in-law was telling me that her husband, my son, was coming up sobbing like a baby. He says, "What's the matter? What happened?" He said, "Can you imagine my mother going through all this? She was much, much younger than we are and going through all this. How terrible that was." But he never asked me anything, never said anything to me. And one day I was invited at the Wiesenthal Center to speak to a conversion class. And due to it, they live across on Sepulveda, not too far from the Wiesenthal Center. So I said, "Would you come and just critique me? Do you think because of my accent, people would understand me?" And I told them my story and so on and so forth. And when it was over, he says, "You know, mother, this is the first time I heard your story from the beginning to the end. How come you never told me?" I said, "Because you never asked me." So that was the first time when he knew my story.
You for sharing. Leah, do you have any insight on this?
My husband, who was a survivor, he was in the resistance because he was older than I am, and he was a Jewish resistance fighter, not a resistance worker in Holland, and ultimately got caught. And when he never spoke about it, I didn't know about it until almost 11 years after we were married. We were in Europe, and one of his friends told me what my husband had been instrumental in doing. So I never knew anything about that. I knew that he was in had been in Bergen-Belsen, but I didn't know what the reason was or why he was caught or anything like that. So he never spoke about it because he said, I live for today and tomorrow, and it's too long ago and nobody's going to believe it anyway. And so why talk about it? And then when our daughter was like in junior high school, she came home and said, Daddy, would you speak? My history class teacher is asking, would you speak? Because about World War II. And he said, no. But she never asked me because my story was kind of, not as I would say not as dramatic as his, for sure not. But she never asked me, but she knows about both our stories, and so do our grandchildren. But the nice thing about our story is that we lost our whole family. My sister and I lost our complete family, but we each have a new family. Her hiding people and my hiding people, they know both of us, and we are always in contact with them. And that already goes to the fourth generation. So that is the contact we still have with our hiding people. But as far as I don't believe that we raised our daughter to be too traumatically affected by our story. She knows our story, she values our story, so do the grandkids, but that's where it, that's where it ends. And my granddaughter has shared our story with when she was a camp counselor and stuff like that. I think she read parts of our story to her camp, to the campers. But that was a nice camp, a summer camp, and not a concentration camp. So
Thank you so much, Leah. We're going to conclude our program now. What I'm going to do is will um, I'm going to start with Harry. First, I would like to share this photo with our audience. This is the family that rescued Harry, and this is him over here on the right, and this is the family. Harry, while I have this photo, can you please share with the audience? I know you mentioned it a little bit, but what is the main purpose that you still speak and share this story on such a regular basis with all sorts of audiences?
Because I like to differentiate between the upstanders, such as you see in this picture, at least the 6 that I'm talking about. I'm in the corner there. I was just the beneficiary. I wasn't one of the. Not only was I not an upstander, I didn't even know what was going on at the time. I played no part in my own survival. These 6 people did, and I wanted to point out the fact that you have these upstanders in a sea of bystanders. Not only, of course, in the Netherlands, but elsewhere. There's also a kind of an additional purpose behind this, which I've never really mentioned before, and that is to correct a misimpression among many people that the Netherlands was this wonderful model of rescuers. And that impression was probably started because of the story in the diary of Anne Frank. While it's true, there were thousands of people in the Netherlands who were rescuers, no question about it. It was a country of rescuers. But at the same time, it was also a country of bystanders and also a country of many perpetrators and collaborators. What many people do not know, for example, is that the second largest number of Nazi supporters in Europe, second only to Germany, was right there in the Netherlands. There were more members of the Nazi party in the Netherlands than in any other country in Europe. The bureaucracy, the bureaucratic methods, the paperwork and so on that was done to process almost the entire Jewish community in the Netherlands, that was carried out not by Germans, but by willing members of the Dutch community. the police were largely Dutch police. We know, for example, that the police who stormed the annex where Anne Frank and her family were living were not Germans, they were Dutch people. They were probably betrayed by Dutch neighbors before they were turned over to the SS. We know that the vast majority of the engineers who drove the trains to the different camps within the Netherlands and up to the border of Germany were all Dutch, not German. In fact, the Dutch railroad system formally apologized back in the year, I think it was 2005 or 2006 for that, and even made some compensatory payments for that. So it's true that the Netherlands was a country of rescuers, but it's also true that it's a very, very complicated story. And I think it's only right to tell audiences about that, to correct the record so that they understand that the Holocaust in general was not a simplistic event. It was extremely complex with many, many different players. And it's important for people to understand that. And it's important to try and encourage people to be on the side of the upstanders rather than the bystanders.
Thank you so much. And Harry, you were at the museum one time sharing your story, and afterwards, a student, an 8th grade student, walked up to you and said, "Thank you for sharing your story. You encouraged me to always be an upstander." So we thank you so much for what you do for our community.
Thank you.
Leah, I'm going to share this photo. This is the only one I have of you here. This is you and your mother.
Correct.
If you could please just share with us, I know you mentioned it as well, but why do you share your story on a regular basis, and why is it important for you to do this?
Well, as I said before, I had to convince myself first that I had a story, but now that I realized that I do have a story, I delved a little deeper and I figured out um, not only the people that hit me, who were wonderful, and I'm still in touch with their daughters who are my age and their children and grandchildren. But ultimately, it was a student organization who organized and located all these upstanders that were willing to take life-threatening risk to take in mostly Jewish children, but also adults, of course. And so I speak to encourage the student 18 years, 17, 18, 19, 20, when they come into being adults, to do the right thing. They have a lot of power to be upstanders, like Harry said, and not bystanders, but to use their power, to encourage them to use their power, because if not for them, I might not be here to tell my story.
Thank you so much, Leah. And I have heard you on a regular basis conclude when you speak to high school students, both in person and this last year on Zoom, you always conclude by telling young students that they have the power to change this world. So we thank you so much. Edith, I have your family's photo here from 1944. This is Edith here. And this is her sister who survived.
Yeah, by Eva.
Edith, why do you share your story, and why have you been doing this for, at this point, a little over 30 years?
For the students, because those are the most influential people. They're gonna have the power to do it. That this thing shouldn't happen again. Shouldn't be any difference between race, color, or religion. we are all created equal, so we should be considered as upstanding citizens, but definitely we were. My father was in in World War II and World War One, and he got a medal for it. And definitely, I miss my little things, my little siblings. I always think that maybe due to us, she was very fair and very chatty. Maybe some SS adopted her, but I'm trying to find her, but at no avail. So that's the reason why I'm sharing it. I'm sharing my story, that students should know that they have the power. We are all created equal, and never ever nobody should hate anybody for color, race, or religion.
Thank you, Edith. And I know that you've spoken at the museum for many years, and you have traveled to schools around the city as part of our educational programs to get that message out there. And we appreciate that so much. And Edith, I have one more photo to share with everybody.
Mm, what a
Yeah,
nice
this is
photo.
when 3 years ago, wasn't Michael?
Yes, 3 years ago.
3 years ago, when we have a female rabbi. She's very charismatic, and she put out the question that who would like to be bat mitzvah? So said, I wouldn't mind that, but I don't remember any Hebrew anymore. So she says, that's my job. Don't you worry about it. And we had classes for, we were three. We were one who came from Connecticut and one who was a conversion. And we all became bat mitzvah. And it was a very unforgettable day. Thank you, Michael, for sharing this.
Edith, what a lovely picture.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much again, Edith, Leah, and Harry, for not only for participating this afternoon, but for everything that you do for our community on a regular basis. And I would also like to extend this thanks and appreciation to all survivors in our community who have done this for the past several years, who have made us as at the museum be able to fulfill our mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. And we're happy that you were able to participate in the inaugural Holocaust Survivor Day. We look forward to commemorating this day in the future. Thank you so much for participating, and we have people typing in the chat and in the comments thanking the three of you. We thank you all so much. Wishing everybody a happy, healthy, and safe weekend ahead. And thank you to all Holocaust survivors around the world for everything they do for our world and our community. Thank you, everybody.
And we
Thanks,
thank you,
Michael.
Michael, for having us.
You're
Thank
so,
you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
of course, it's our pleasure. Thank you.
Sign off.